Got it.
Okay, go ahead, Eileen.
Okay, so hi folks, good afternoon. I'm Eileen McAver Kane from Rockland Community College, and thank you for coming. Today's presentation will be shared on SUNY Workplace, both the slides and the recording. So I wanted to make sure you know that. And as we start, I wanted to begin by acknowledging the original inhabitants of the land that we are on. And I know we're coming in from all over SUNY and New York State. For me, it's the Muncie Lenape land. So I'm down here. Rockland Community College is in Suffern, New York. That's where I'm located. And then I wanted to give you a little bit about my background and why I'm here today presenting to you. First of all, I wanted to thank my colleagues on the SUNY DEI committee, Dr. Baston at Rockland Community College and Melissa Roy, both who have given me opportunities and are advocates for this type of work. And thanks to NEA and NICET, because the reason why I'm presenting is I completed an implicit bias train the trainer in the fall of 2020. So that's where the information and highlights that I'm going to share with you today come from. So I'm an art educator, an artist, and an art and social justice advocate. And as I mentioned, I recently completed this training. And one thing I want to make clear to everyone is that the training was a 5-week intensive training. We met for 5 weeks, sometimes several times a week for a couple of hours a week. So what I'm sharing with you today is just really the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to share some highlights and some of the things that I learned, and you can continue with your own work in this area. So we're going to start with community agreements, talk about the definition of implicit bias, the cycle of socialization, the implications of implicit bias, strategies that you can use, and have a bit of a discussion. I know we have a lot of people here, so the discussion will take place through the chat. And then at the end, I'll share some resources with you as well. So throughout the training, we would always begin with community agreements. And, this is something to always keep in mind when you do this work: stay engaged, speak your truth. It's okay to experience discomfort. You're going to dive into some areas where you're going to be connecting with your feelings. Expect and accept non-closure, agree to disagree, maintain confidentiality. And when you're working in groups, it's important to develop trust. What is said here stays here. And all participate. You want to make sure no one dominates, and honor time. So, we talk about using a parking lot for off-track topics to stay on topic. And in order to have difficult conversations needed to advance racial justice, we must practice mindfulness, pay attention to your thoughts, emotions, and feelings, exercise self-compassion, be intentional, be reflective, and above all else, breathe. So the definition of implicit bias is a mental process that stimulates negative attitudes about people who are not members of one's own in-group. Implicit racial bias leads to discrimination against people who are not members of one's own racial group. And next, I'm going to share this short video with you.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up
in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race, and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
And I do have the link for this in the resources. So if you want to follow up on this, you'll be able to.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016
Sorry.
was the year.
Here's the next one. Okay. So, in exploring the definition, in his book, Professor Drew Weston tells us, irrespective of what we may feel and believe, most white Americans, including many who hold consciously progressive values and attitudes, harbor negative associations toward people of color. And as the woman in the video mentioned, we're socialized that way. We may not even stand a chance. And we have an implicit mind, part of the brain that we commonly call the subconscious or the unconscious. And very often our subconscious attitudes are less egalitarian than our conscious attitudes. So why should we care? This phenomenon has the power to influence policies and conditions in the real world, and it distorts the opportunity that all Americans must have to achieve success. And it affects where we live, where we work, who our children's friends are, who our friends are, which political candidates we vote for, what social programs we support, etc. And there's a cycle of socialization that, we all go through. It determines the way we see ourselves and others, shapes our core values and beliefs. It occurs without conscious effort to teach it, and it's the source of what we know to be true. So, in the beginning, when we're babies, we're not affected by much of anything, but then socialization begins. You have institutional, societal socialization. These get enforced. Results end up in implicit bias. And unless you take a, conscious effort to change, that status quo is going to keep going. And this is a little hard to read, but it'll be in the presentation. So, if you don't do anything and you don't make waves, it's just going to perpetuate. And at the core of this is fear, ignorance, confusion, and insecurity. So direction for change: raise your consciousness, interrupt, educate, take a stand, question, and reframe. What are the implications of implicit bias? Well, microaggressions and stereotypes. So microaggressions, verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights. And often these are automatic and unintentional, and they occur in brief instances on a daily basis. You can communicate with hostility, derogatory or negative viewpoints, and they perpetuate this worldview of white supremacy culture. This, little graphic shows some of the things that happened. When I read this one, personal story, I used to cringe whenever I was with my mom. She felt she was anything from, bias, or she would consider herself very open-minded, but she would, say, well, where are you from? Where are you really from? If someone had an accent. And we do these things not even realizing, what the implications are. And you have micro assaults, deliberate, conscious, and explicit. And some people do that. But as you go down this list, micro insults. So typically they're not intentional, might be a joke or something. Micro invalidations, typically unintentional. And you just exclude, negate, and nullify an individual's thoughts or feelings. And then when you look at stereotypes are mental shortcuts that can be useful psychologically, but they're very harmful. Stereotypes make us feel more right in our own narrow thinking. And information that's counter to our stereotype gets thrown out as an anomaly. And they become these self-fulfilling stereotypes. And they're hard to shift. We miss important information that could expand our thinking because we're stuck in stereotypes. There are stereotypes of omission, where we make groups invisible and create stories about them in their absence. And then there are stereotypes of distortion, where we create caricatures of groups. And there's really no such thing as a good stereotype. Any stereotype that narrows the humanity of someone is harmful. And this is a pyramid of white supremacy. And often we may run into people who say, well, politics don't affect me. I know, I've heard plenty of people say that, especially in this past 6 months, if not in, year, right? And they want to be apolitical and two sides to every story. But as you study this graphic and, learn about history and what can result, things that go unchecked can really have very serious consequences. So what are some strategies? And in the training that I took, they talk a lot about mirrors and windows. And mirrors, you want to start with mirrors, and that's looking inward. So how to challenge your own implicit bias. And there's implicit association test. There'll be a link to that. Be aware of your own mindset. Explore your personal narrative and create your own racial autobiography. Explore different interpretations of what you perceive or think you know, and question and counter stereotypes. Before I took the training, I thought I was pretty aware of my own autobiography. And I'd been to, maybe some other presentations and done some reading. But it was really interesting when I dove in deep how much I realized we are all affected by race and all in different ways, from a young child and who your models were and the neighborhood you grew up in. And then the windows portion. So, you look inward with the mirrors, and then windows. What can you do? What can you do to be an advocate or to address implicit bias? Name it. Be clear about your own intentions. Be specific. That's not okay when this happens. That's problematic when. Claim it. Use I statements. I don't like it when you do such and such. I'm not comfortable with. Stop it. Clarify expectations. Say, please don't use sexist language, racist comments, whatever it is that you're finding objectionable or, you can see as being a problem. And we're going to move to a discussion part of our program today. But before I do that, I wanted to find out, does anyone have any questions?
So if anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A. I think there's one question so far, and I'll just hit answer live after you answer it. Ronald asks, can Black people also be guilty of implicit bias?
I'm not the absolute judge on this, but I will tell you, when I went through the training, what was really interesting is we did the implicit bias association test, and you guys will, you folks will get the link to that, and you'll be able to do it yourself. And then, so we were in a fairly large group. I think there were probably 30 to 50 of us, but then they put us in small breakout groups where we could share. So there were probably about 6 people, and we shared our results. And 2 of the people that were Black in our group, African American, both said that they had implicit bias towards white people, you know, and they examined that. So I would say my answer would be based on what I learned in the training, that yes, and they talked at length about that cycle of socialization, so that their own personal experiences as they grew up, they were kind of told, well, you know, the white neighborhood is better, or the white this is better, and the, you know, the models, the things that were modeled for them gave them this, you know, they didn't even realize it, you know, that's how they came up in the results of this test. So I guess my answer would be based on that. Yeah.
And the second question is suggesting saying, please don't use racist or sexist language seems to like a surefire way to shut down the person speaking that way. It doesn't seem like an effective approach. Can you speak to that?
Well, you know, everyone has to kind of own their own strategy. I would say, again, from my own personal experience, part of why I wanted to go through this training is experiences I've had, and I won't go into detail, but, you know, I was at a family event where there was something racist said, and, you know, I feel like my family's pretty liberal minded, but we were all kind of, you know, our mouths were dropped open and people didn't know how to respond, you know, and people didn't respond quickly enough. They were just kind of struck dumb, right? So I thought to myself, well, I don't want to be struck dumb anymore. I want to learn the tools to speak up. So, you know, I can say from personal experience that I wish for my own, you know, my own self that I had spoken up that day, you know. So part of what you're working with in the world is you want to stop people, and you also want to live with yourself. And you can say it in a very polite way. You don't have to, in fact, in the training, you're told really not to fight. And I know people were concerned that when they gave this training, okay, if somebody objects and somebody starts an argument, you know, and our trainers said, well, remind them that they asked you to be here because they wanted to learn about this, and they wanted to maybe learn how they can maybe change their behavior. So, you know, you don't have to fight with people, you know, look at all the different tools and things that you have, and then you decide for yourself.
All right, next question is from Greg. Do you have any tips for getting people with entrenched views to begin the mirror?
You know, being as open-minded as you can. And I know in the training that I had, our leader said that she has changed her approach, and rather than look at things in a very black and white way, the more you can say it's complicated, you know. I know from my own experience, I write an ethics blog, and as a result of an MFA program I did. And I know I learned that, you know, things are not black and white. It's a spectrum of gray. And I think when you approach that with people, and, you know, maybe in a smaller scale, instead of necessarily calling them out, you know, if you can, to me, if you can always make it personal to people and say, you know, try to make them think how they would feel, you know, so that whole mirror. So if you can kind of have them reflect on how they would feel, that's a strategy that I typically try to use.
And then a follow-up question from Greg. I have the responsibility of designing a culturally diverse leadership course. Do you have any tips or good resources?
Off the top of my head, I have tons of resources. So I would say follow up with me by email, and I'm happy to share resources. And I think as part of our DEI, Chris, we're going to possibly have some other forums and discussions on this topic. So if my email is not available, well, I can't see the chat right now, but I'm happy to share it. You can find me in the SUNY system. Chris will get it to you. So yeah, I'm happy to share resources.
Certainly. Okay, so there's a few more coming in. So I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. So probably like 1 o'clock, we'll have to start the activity, right? So we have a few more minutes for questions.
Yeah, because we do have a lot of discussion questions as well. Sure,
Yeah,
I'm
so
good
why
with
don't
that.
we at least go to 1 and that'll give us some time.
Sure.
So there's a question. I don't know that this is necessarily appropriate for you to answer in the context of this, Eileen, and that's something that we can ask in the discussion forum. But someone was asking if they were aware of any SUNY institutions that have racism as an institutional learning outcome. I don't know if Rockland does or not. Do they? Do you?
You know, I don't know off the top of my head, tell you the truth. I have to pull up my ILOs. Yeah.
Yeah, if there's anybody in the chat, like, so the chat's open now. If anybody wants to address that in the chat, we could do that way.
I don't know if Melissa's if Melissa's in here, she may know for me, our chief diversity officer at Rockland.
All right, so I'm looking for questions. All right. Raj is asking, all right, anonymous attendee, perhaps not intentionally, just equated racism with a conservative point of view in your story of your family. I have a very conservative political point of view, and I'm very sensitive to racism. Liberals are not inherently anti-racist, and conservatives are not inherently racist. So I guess more of a comment than a question.
I really appreciate that. And that is a moment that's occurred to me different times in my life. And I think it's important to be reminded of it. You know, I have you reminded me of a personal story where you're exactly right. So thanks for reminding me of that. Yeah.
Raj asks, can you comment in more detail on how strategies might alter based on peers, supervisors, and most importantly, in our classroom conversations?
You know, to me, the more you do practice strategies, the more aware you are about it. So before or I guess through this work, as you look at, you know, and some of the discussion questions that we're going to have next will maybe prompt you to think of things. I realized some of the things that I maybe unintentionally did, you know, where, you know, maybe comment on somebody's name. That's for me unusual, but maybe not for them, right? So I come from this, you know, Irish Catholic background. My name's Eileen. I'm sure to some people, my name is not one they see all the time. So educators, you know, you want to realize that your frame of reference is not the only frame of reference, and kind of check those types of things. I did think, did I address it, Chris, with that answer?
Yeah. There's another question here. Adam asks, how can students be encouraged to consider implicit bias? It seems to be an instant turnoff, and there is an instant bias maybe when white students hear bias or diversity.
I think the more you can possibly bring it into your classroom. So some of the projects and things that I've worked on, you know, I do COIL, Collaborative Online International Learning, and we've worked with South Africa, and you know, we'll discuss it, how students initially, some of the comments are, oh, they speak English. Well, yeah, it's their, you know, their national language, you know, and to not necessarily point fingers at each other, but to bring it up for discussion, talk about, you know, well, are there instances when, you know, you've been the other? And I know I use examples for my students to point it out and try to get them to reflect. You know, luckily, I think, unless people, you know, I don't know what people are thinking internally, but I think when I go about it that way, usually we have a fairly transparent and open discussion.
All right, there's one more question, and I think we'll have to move on to discussion. Odette asks, can you further elaborate on your response to the question that Black people have implicit bias in terms of the dynamics of power and the dangers of assuming that implicit bias is equal or common amongst all groups? So I don't think that's exactly what you said, but maybe that's good that you're being asked to elaborate on that.
Yeah, and I was just giving an anecdotal example, you know, so I do want to be clear that I'm sharing the highlights from my training, and I'm not, you know, I had a 5-week training, so I don't have a master's degree in this, or, you know, it's anecdotal from my own experience. So I was sharing what 2 people in my group had said as a result of the test. And you may want to take that test and then see where you stand, because it's a scale, and it'll say, well, do you lean more toward white thinking or black thinking? You know, it's a test that Harvard puts out that you can get online, and the resources have the link. You know, and some of us were, you know, I think mine was right in the middle, you know, and some people were maybe more on one side or the other. And the 2 people in my group that were African American talked about how theirs were white leaning, you know, and well, why were they biased toward white when they were African American? And we just, again, it's a safe space for unpacking feelings and emotions, and they shared in that their own feeling, why they got that way, was probably because the way they had been socialized, you know, that these messages that maybe they received through the media, or, you know, where they lived, and, you know, that whole cycle of socialization.
All right, so do you want to go ahead to the next slide and we'll start the discussion?
Sure. Oh, so I just wanted to, you know, again, remind people of community agreements, because it's you know, sensitive topic, you know, and people can get charged up about it. So I won't read through them again, but I put them up here again. And then I just put this one, right? So we will have multiple perspectives on the subject. Our personal philosophy is often interwoven with our own culture and upbringing. Being respectful of each other is of utmost importance. And yeah, and, you know, as somebody reminded me not to equate liberals with not having implicit bias, you know, I agree with that. Be open to looking at yourself, and that's the best thing that you can do. So our first discussion question, and you can answer in the chat, what examples of bias have you or our students or members heard or experienced because of their, and you can fill in the blank. And we've been talking about, you know, issues of race, but there's all kinds of examples of bias that we have. So you can, you know, put in any type of bias that you or you've seen your students experience.
So if you could use the chat function for this, not the Q&A forum, please. I think that'll make it a lot easier to kind of just see what everybody has. So if you'd like to share examples of bias you or students or members heard of or experienced, just put that in the chat and we'll all be able to see it. Eileen included, but
Actually, I can't see it, so
you can't see it.
I have a full screen, so just let me know.
So I'm just going to start reading them as they come in. So lower academic expectations due to race and ethnicity among students, I assume.
Yeah, and as people are putting that in the chat, I know Rockland Community College, they had conversations with students about microaggression, and that's available. I could follow up with that with Dr. Baston, and it was really enlightening about the type of microaggressions and that our students had experienced on campus. It was such a wonderful discussion, and things you don't even realize, you know, and that's another way to learn about your behavior. You know, it's like, oh, you know, I maybe never even realized that I do this to students, you know. And that lower expectations, I know, was talked about in that conversation with Dr. Baston.
So just going to keep reading through here. Oh, they go fast. So I got expectations about athleticism due to race. I'm seeing more Confederate flags this year than in my past 68 years. Strong example of bias. Someone saying they have experienced bias because of my heritage. I've experienced bias because of my heritage. My Black students sometimes assume that I will treat them differently until they get to know me, but I'm sure I have bias too, but I need to learn more about it. When I first started teaching, I learned of large continuing inequity in access to sports resources between men's and women's teams, not racial bias, but gender bias. As a woman, I state something in a meeting and it is ignored, and then a male says the exact same thing and it is acknowledged.
Oh, that's one that rings so true for me in my life and my, not even so much in teaching, but I worked for many years in the design industry, and
I've experienced bias because of age.
yeah, absolutely.
Someone said they're misgendered consistently. One of our faculty has a Confederate flag flying at her house, so I won't have my Black students take any course from her. Hearing people talk about good neighborhoods when referring to predominantly white neighborhoods.
It's like a coded kind of a word.
This is very dated, but I have a friend who's African American and we grew up in Kentucky, Appalachia. This student was discouraged by a high school teacher from going to university and encouraged to just get a job because of his race. He is now president of the Commonwealth of Kentucky's higher education governing body. Bias towards immigrants is rampant.
Yeah, it's a Pandora's box once you begin to think about it, what you've seen, experienced.
I've had students with mobility issues who feel frustrated that people assume that they are less intelligent or incapable of doing things. Okay, it's slowing down. Do you want to jump to the next?
Yeah, I'll go to the next discussion. And yeah, and I would say I have my list. I think we touched upon some of these, Chris: race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religious affiliation, language ability, family status, ability, immigration status. There's socioeconomic status. Yeah, there's a lot. Okay.
Someone mentioned on this topic, the thought was mentioned about bias towards one academic ability by race, but I think it may occur based on a community or high school one may come from. Can you speak more about this?
That I don't know what I would say. I don't know if I have any of my other members on my committee who would want to speak to that. I think that is definitely socioeconomic, and maybe people speak to, in code about that, like a good neighborhood, or you want to live in this school district. I've definitely heard that.
I just wanted to say too that people aren't seeing the chat. I guess only the panelists are seeing the chat. So I thought we had turned it on that everybody could see it. So if we could turn on the chat so everybody could see the chat, that would be helpful for the next question. Sorry about that.
It's okay. You want me to go to the next question?
Wait.
Okay, you just let me know. No rush.
Can we set it up? Can we set it up so that everybody can see all the chat, please? All right, hopefully that works. If not, I'll just read them out. All right, so next question.
Okay. And then we wanted to share what are some of the steps that you can take to challenge implicit bias, microaggression, and or stereotypes based on the things we just discussed. And I know someone asked me earlier, so I shared a little bit about what I do in the classroom on a personal basis, just trying to question, what I do, what I think, check myself, and
So
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if folks want to answer this one, you should be able to send the chat to all panelists and attendees if you'd like everybody to see it. If you'd prefer just the panelists to see it, then you could send to all panelists. So you should be able to have. All right, so these are coming into all panelists, so I'll just read them. Don't ignore them, but approach and challenge them respectfully. See something, say something, often in a question format, or as you stated, from an I perspective. You can make an effort to learn more, about whoever or whatever you have a bias to. To keep any biases I might have in check, I do blind grading. Speak up. Try to be accepting of people's experiences and find the truth in their experience, even if it disagrees with your own.
Good suggestions.
Ask for additional information. Be aware of your own bias. Educate yourself and try to challenge yourself to learn about what you are biased about. Ask for data, facts, not so much opinions.
Yeah, what are people's statements based on? That's I know that was one I used myself over the past 6 months with political things. I would say, well, why do you think that? Where did you read that? Or, just try to take it back to a fact-based statement.
I'm not seeing any new ones in there. And again, if you'd like to share it with everybody, you should be able to send it to all panelists and attendees. There is a question that we had that I don't know if maybe you want to address now, Eileen. And someone
Sure.
asked, with an increase in awareness, do we run the risk of oversensitizing?
My personal belief is no, not at all. I don't think you could ever be oversensitive because yeah, I don't see a downside personally. I don't know if anybody else on the panel wants to speak to that. It just becomes part of how you operate. It's not like you're overly sensitive. You just operate at a different level, hopefully, is the goal.
All right, there's a couple more things coming in here. Learn and engage with cultures different from your own while taking the time to reflect on personal beliefs and practice. And someone mentioned that people can be overly aggressive, not overly sensitive. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's all I see.
Yeah. Okay. So I do have a couple of last reflection things to make sure we have time for those as well. People might have questions when I go to those. So you want me to move on?
Sure.
Okay. And I put these, kind of, I have 2 slides on reflection, and in that whole theme of, mirroring, right? So what can you do? And it's, learn about it, and folks that showed up today, you're curious about the topic, right? And then you can go from here and explore your own personal narrative. And it's important to understand the source of your belief systems, values, and preferences, and reflect on the following. What memories do you have from your upbringing about the differences among people? What childhood experiences did you have with peers or adults who were different from you in some way? What have you learned from your culture of origin that informs your values and behaviors? And think about the people you know personally and your experiences and interactions with them. How does this compare with what you were taught or told as a child? And I know from my own personal experience, it's complicated, so some of the people that maybe were the kindest and dearest to you, you realize, oh, they had some racist attitudes and beliefs, and you have to make peace with that, and okay, well, that was wrong what they did. It doesn't mean that part of them was anything I want to take with me. And I'm sure all of us have that complication in our lives and our backgrounds. And then that leads us to explore different interpretations, with the knowledge of other ways to interpret a situation. So you do the work, you reflect, mirrors, and then what are you going to do now when you go into situations? So hopefully, rather than be overly sensitive, you're going to identify or create a better way to handle situations. That's the goal of this work. So thinking about recent interactions that you may have had with someone, of another race, gender identity, sexual orientation, fill in the blank, that may have been less than uplifting or may have been difficult, and reflect on what happened, So what actually happened, or what did I observe? What meaning am I applying? What happened? What was my observation? What other meanings can be applied to my observation? And then, how else could I perceive or interpret the situation? And, even thinking about, how else could I maybe have handled it? And then moving forward, what could I do with it? And then the last piece that I have really are just the resources. And we do have, I guess, a little bit more time. Chris, I know you wanted to talk about SUNY Workplace, but if you want to see if people have other questions or anything else you want me to
Yeah,
talk about.
what I'm going to do is I'm going to share in the chat the link to the presentation so folks can have it, and also all the links that you have in that last slide, so you all can access the presentation there at that link. And the other thing I wanted to share with you all is we do have a space in Workplace where many of you are actually there already and participated in some of these discussions we had in the fall. If you did not and are interested, I put the link to our workplace group, our discussion, diversity, equity, inclusion discussion forum there. So we can continue the conversation there, or if you find resources regarding implicit bias that you'd like to bring to our attention, I think that would be a great place to do that. I also want to thank Eileen for doing this. I mean, she's on our planning team for the diversity, equity, inclusion discussion forum, and we were trying to think about what we could do this semester and beyond just having discussions. And Eileen mentioned that she had taken this course and said, I could share what I learned in my course. And so I really appreciate Eileen kind of, stepping up, but we didn't expect that we'd have 267 people attend when we initially threw it out there, but it really speaks to the importance of this topic. And I know that, this is really meant, as I said, or as we said in the discussion, in the title of it, it's really meant to be a discussion about implicit bias, conversation about it, a starting point, and certainly not a sufficient, really necessary, but not sufficient introduction to the topic. And I think Eileen did a fantastic job. So I'm applauding you and Eileen, and hopefully everybody else as well. But we do have some time left. We have 15 minutes, in fact. So if you want to stick around, we can take additional questions. And I don't know if you'd be willing to, if anybody wants to use their mic to ask a question, I certainly could give someone the mic if they want to talk, but we have the Q&A tool. So why don't we just kind of open it up?
Sure. And I think I'm still sharing screen. Should I exit that part of it, or?
Yeah, you might as well. We could. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see.
So yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to put in the chat.
Yeah.
Feel free to. I'll put my video on too. Oh, you know what? Your video went off, Eileen.
Oh no.
It was that
That
problem you
happened
had
the
the other
last
day.
time.
Yeah,
I apologize, you guys. I thought I had solved it, so I'll put a picture of myself up there.
there you go.
So
I'll
I'm
put mine
here. You
on.
have my audio, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So does anybody want to ask a question? Oh, is it Malin? Hey, Malin.
Hi. Well, it's not a question, just a comment. I just want to say thank you to Eileen. This is a very tough conversation. Topic, as we saw in the chest, clearly a need. So Eileen, thank you for being such a trooper and taking this on for our first chat of the semester. You did amazing.
Oh, well, thanks. And I really have appreciated being part of this group that we're in, the DEI. And, as part of the training I took, I realized even more than when I started how important it is. So, it's a very small thing that I could share. So I'm happy that I was able to do it.
So would someone asked if they could share this with their anti-racism group with other faculty? I assume the presentation, and are you willing, you're okay with folks sharing this,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Everything that I shared is all, public domain, open education resource material, and the recording of me, I'm fine with that as well. And I don't know, should I put my email in the chat if anybody wants to follow up with me?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
So would anybody like to ask
I
a
don't know if I
question,
could
or
do it. I can't do it to everyone, but I'll do it to.
if you do it to me, I'll make sure it gets
Okay.
to everybody.
Make sure I spell it correctly. Looks like there's a couple of questions, right?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the workplace group is only SUNY specific. So I apologize if anybody found out about this webinar outside of SUNY. We can't add people to it outside of SUNY. So I'm sorry, but we'll keep the webinars and things open to folks from outside of SUNY. There's Eileen's email. I will share your email now to everybody. So here's Eileen's email. Anybody want to open their mic and ask a question? Feel free. Just raise your hand, and you'll get put to the top of the list, and I can open up your. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Chris, somebody asked, will our organization have a future webinar on Black Lives Matter?
If you have any ideas or suggestions for topics, we're certainly open to consider anything. Malin from the team is here. Obviously, Eileen's on our team. But you can, I'll put my email in the list too here. So if you have ideas for topics, you could shoot me an email, and I'll bring it to our team. And again, we're totally open. This is really meant to be an open sort of discussion forum for everybody throughout SUNY, and really the topics will be determined by your interest and what you want to talk about.
Yeah, and somebody just asked, where did I complete the training? And I answered them. It was so nice, and it was an email. There was actually a Black Lives Matter virtual protest that came through in, I think it was in June, and I attended it. And then during that, they asked, did anybody want to, or it might have been a follow-up email, were they interested in continuing the work? And I said yes, and then they contacted me about the training. And Shamika, my colleague, asked, biases are unavoidable, but learning to confront and undo them is the hardest part. What are the top 3 ways to undo biases? Top 3 ways. I think just to become aware of them would be number 1, to be open-minded, to be aware of them, and then don't respond. Knowledge is power. The more you know about it, the more likely you are to then not fall prey to that, And I know I go back and I think about, I cringe sometimes at things I've done in the classroom, which really are not that bad. But I think, oh, if I had realized that maybe that was a bit of a microaggression, what I said to that student, so then I consciously, as I go forward, try to check it. Yeah.
Awareness, education. I like it. Tamika's
Yeah.
taking notes for us in the chat. I love it.
Transparency, own it, right? So, rather than get defensive, consider it and, what are they saying?
Karen, I'm going to give you the permission to talk. So, oh, did I already do that? Wait a second here. A lot of talk. Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. A very good presentation. I appreciate it. And this is a very large one, society-wise and politically. In some of the suburbs around Rochester, folks at our college have offered to do diversity training, or a lot of entities have really anti-racist training. And the superintendents won't allow it because of the police basically lobbying to the extent that they don't want anything to do with it, because they're feeling that it's going to all be about, if it's Black Lives Matter, then it's the police are all bad. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know. Chris, do you have an answer to that one?
No, I don't. And but it definitely speaks to, I mean, we've seen a lot of this in the last, I don't know, 6 months. We've seen a lot of resistance to diversity training. I don't know, Maylin, you want to jump in?
Well, I just wanted to add that many campuses have done some joint partnerships, like with their campus police and their chief diversity officer. So I can forward you some information. As far as system-wide diversity initiatives, a lot happening because I work for the senior vice chancellor and chief diversity officer. And we know there were a lot of things happening system-wide, but there are some campuses that are joining forces and coming together to have those conversations on the campus with their faculty and administration first, and then the students. So I don't know what can happen outside the communities of our colleges, obviously, but our colleges are their own communities with their students. So I think it's important that we do encourage that to happen more frequently, and hopefully it trickles out to the community outside of it. But I think that is a very tough conversation, especially in today's world that we're currently living.
Thanks, Karen. There are a couple other questions in the chat. I don't know if you see those, Eileen. You want to answer live?
Yeah,
Christine's.
you mentioned a reference regarding a good neighborhood. How would you refer? Sorry, I'm reading loud. Yeah, I was talking about, I guess, those stereotypes, right? I try not to use the word good myself. I'm from a good neighborhood. I try and this is a whole different thing, but I know, I'm a grandmother now, and I hear my sisters say things like, "Oh, but they're such a good baby," and it's like, all babies are good. All babies are wonderful. It's not a matter of being good or bad. So I just try to take that out of my vocabulary, actually. Yeah.
Soul One, I'm giving you the permission to talk. I'm sorry, I don't know who you are, other than your username. Do you want to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody made the point that the superintendents, I think in the Rochester area, are not open to having a Black Lives Matter discussion or discussion on diversity and inclusion. I don't think it's up to the superintendent. I think it's up to the Board of Education. So I would discuss that with the Board of Education if the superintendent seems to be throwing up roadblocks, because we need to have these conversations if we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I think the police departments were also nervous about those conversations as well. I mean, I live in Rochester, actually, so I know we've had, unfortunately, our fair share of conflict and strife and issues going on in the last 6 months plus. So yeah, but thanks for chiming in there. Christina, you had your name, you have your hand up as well. Would you like to jump in? I'll give you permission to talk.
Hi. So
Hi.
Christina. Hi. So I find the Rochester situation January 6th and our politicians' comments about that, and I'm sorry, my dog is attacking me, supremely ironic, because when you think about January 6th and the politicians, this is not who we are, this is not who we are, when in fact, white racist violence is exactly who we've been. I mean, that's part of American history. And until we start to own that and acknowledge it, it's hard to expect anybody to really move forward if you're coming from a place of denial. And with Rochester, you know, it's the same thing. You know, different chapters, same story. If you take a look, I would encourage anybody to go back 50 years, 50 years and look at sitcoms or look at news media coverage where, you know, Blacks are shown or persons of color are shown in very violent stories. And then what the commentary is, and then, you know, take a look at what's going on today. And, you know, to some extent, I participated in a workshop, a couple of years ago, and they were doing word, like the peanut butter and jelly, word association. And one of the things, you know, you say black, they say white, you say peanut butter, they say jelly, you say police. And 20 years ago, trust. And today, that's not the response you get. And it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or what your gender identity is. In a group like that, and, you know, someone going to a word association thing, chances are the majority of your responses are not going to be trust when it comes to police. And the media, the social media and the mass media are incredibly influential. And the earlier comment, there was an earlier question about are persons of color biased? Absolutely. You know, I'll go absolutely on it. How can you not be biased when you grow up and you are confronted every day in mass media and social media with images of persons of color perpetrating violence, without the fact, without the side story that just as many whites, if not more, are perpetrating the same violence? When you look at Vogue and you think about beauty, the models are all white. When was the first time a Black model hit the cover of Vogue? So media, you know, just pounds this into you. And, you know, it would take a very strong individual as a child moving into young adulthood to not be biased, you know, with something like that. So I think you really have to, you know, look to the history and look at what's going on currently, see how things have changed, and acknowledge that often things have not changed. And then we have to own it. And then we have to use our power to see what we can do, big or small, every little bit helps to try and move that needle forward and to not accept it. Okay, I'll get off my.
Thank you, Christina. No, you're getting a lot. You're getting a lot of kudos in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. And actually it kind of addresses a little bit, there was a question in the chat about how do campuses get started. I don't know, it looks like it was answered, but I think that really is.
Yeah, I thought we were gonna, ask,
speak up,
advocate.
Get started, advocate, you know, and we're, you know, I always find it's best to get started with a group. New Paltz has done a really good job with Black Lives Matter at New Paltz. They did a presentation that I think we're going to ask them to do again at some point if they'd be willing, on how they got that going in New Paltz. And so, and it really was just a group of, you know, concerned staff and faculty and students getting together and kind of saying, what can we do to change here at New Paltz? How can we work with administration? How can we, you know, what practical strategies can we, steps can we take, right? And there was one more question I wanted to take. I'm sorry, Eileen, go ahead.
No, I just was agreeing too.
Yeah. Someone asked a couple of times, do you have any go-to phrases for the situation of hearing an unsensitive comment and you don't want to remain silent? It's difficult to respond without being offensive myself. So is there anything like that you will say? You said a few things earlier in the presentation, but I think that's a good thing to maybe leave folks with.
I wish I was better at it than I am. I'll admit that. I always go to the I, the I place. And this is something, and, I don't think this is exactly correct. My husband had told us this when my son was growing up, and we would talk about this at the dinner table. And he would say, I just always own it. So if somebody is making fun of somebody, I'll say, don't say that. I have a sister-in-law. I have and he would just always say, like I am that person, and make it personal, and not fight, not yell, but try to make someone see you as that person, in a gentle way is usually the best path, because if you get aggressive, usually you turn somebody off, they get defensive.
All right. Well, I want to thank you again, Eileen, and thank you all for coming today. Hopefully you all get into that workplace group. We can continue the conversation there, and we do have, and I just maybe put a quick plug in for this. I did send an email out about this earlier today. On February 18th, from 1 to 2, we have a discussion forum where it'll be 100% discussion. We'll have a welcome from the SUNY Chief Diversity Officer, Teresa Miller, who Malin mentioned before, and she will do a quick welcome, but then on the 18th, and I'm going to put the registration link in the chat, it'll be pretty much all discussion. So, today we had a little presentation, a little discussion. On the 18th, again, registration in the link there, there'll be a pretty much at least a good full half an hour, 40 minutes of discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we plan on doing one of these a month from now until the end of the spring semester. So you could register for the one February 18th for 1 to 2 there. And like I said, hopefully we'll see you in that workplace group. And thanks again, Eileen.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Let me share what I learned. And thanks everybody who came. Yeah.
Okay.
Chris, am I still live?
You are still live, Christine.
Hey, I am negotiating with Hollebeck right now for webinars for trauma response in the workplace. And we're not talking about gunshots, and we're not talking